honoring America's military and the service members who sacrifice for our freedoms. Good evening, and thanks for joining us for this special edition of Faith Nation from our news bureau in Washington. I'm John Jessup. Well, a nonstop pounding headache for 9 months, the first symptom of an invisible battle scar for one veteran military pilot. For him and a tremendous number of others, traumatic brain injury haunts America's servicemen and women. National security correspondent Caitlin Burke reports on a Pentagon initiative designed to prevent, identify, and treat this hidden wound.
In the early 2000s, when American forces first began fighting what would become a 20-year war on terror, there was little understanding of the causes or long-term impact of traumatic brain injuries. For many dedicated warriors, it was these invisible wounds that would become haunting and painful reminders of their time on the battlefield.
Greg Coker, a retired U.S. Army Special Forces aviator, was shot down in 2004 while serving in Iraq. Among the wounds he sustained, a lingering traumatic brain injury.
My first symptoms, I had a headache. I've never had a migraine, but I had my head pounded for 9 months, constantly, nonstop.
Despite seeing several specialists, no one could identify the treatment Coker needed or even pinpoint the brain injury. So after his physical wounds healed, he went on to serve 5 more combat deployments, unknowingly exposing his brain to even more trauma.
It's overpressure from, incoming enemy fire, just blast from door breaches and charges.
It wasn't until after Coker retired in 2007 that he truly began experiencing symptoms from multiple injuries to his brain.
I would just forget things, so I would have to use my sticky notes, or I carried a tape recorder with me, actually, so I just had problems recalling.
Coker admits this took him to a pretty dark place mentally before choosing to seek help. Fortunately, he found state-of-the-art treatment which provided an explanation of his long-term symptoms and even helped to reverse some of the damage. That's not the norm, however, as recent data shows less than half of the veterans suffering this injury's lasting effects will actually seek help. And those sustaining a brain injury after serving in Iraq and Afghanistan are twice as likely to consider suicide. The Pentagon realized it had a growing problem and began to take action.
We had a lot of good work being done in these various areas throughout a very large Department of Defense.
Over the last 20 years, huge strides have been made in researching and treating traumatic brain injuries. Now comes a new plan to build on that momentum with a single comprehensive strategy known as the Warfighter Brain Health Initiative.
This called for, let's all get on the same page and synergize our efforts and coordinate it tightly so we could accelerate findings and help warfighters in a quicker way.
One of the first steps of the 5-part plan will be to identify the baseline brain health of all service members, which can then be monitored throughout their career.
The military works all in protocols and standards, right? So if we have an every 5-year time period that you have to get your cognition checked, that's the standard. Everybody gets it. It doesn't matter if you were deployed, if you were a cook, if you were support logistics staff, you're going to get your cognition looked at. So that takes away some of the stigma about why me? Why do I have to go? Does somebody think there's something wrong with me? And we find that there's better compliance that way.
Policies will also be developed to prevent, identify, and treat brain damage caused in training as well as combat.
Some of the technology that's part of this program as well, like putting blast sensors on and looking at how much blast energy goes to the body, warfighters are already making changes when they are out in the field conducting field activities because they see the numbers and they say, whoa, that's a little high. I need to stand back more. Or maybe we only need 3 people here and not 4 people here.
Some of the Pentagon's progress in this area comes from research into chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, the brain disease associated with many NFL players.
With these repetitive insults over time, the disease can be triggered and then it can progress all the way to dementia and death at the end stage of the disease.
Veterans have also been diagnosed with this serious neurodegenerative disease, which currently can only be found post-mortem.
This plan also puts all that under one roof so that as we get findings, we can try to do something much earlier than finding it when somebody's passed away and you look at their brain tissue.
For years, veterans like Coker have been advocating for this kind of support from the top. And while he says it's long overdue, he believes these new policies could save lives.
You can't control enemy incoming weapon systems or whatever the case, but we sure can. We sure can put in safety standards and things like that to ensure that everybody's safe.
The military has 6 to 48 months to implement the 53 action steps detailed in the Warfighter Brain Health Initiative, although completing some aspects of the plan could take much longer. For example, obtaining brain assessments of all personnel, new recruits, active duty, National Guard, and reserves could take about 5 years. A long undertaking expected to pay off in the time and investment. Caitlin Burke, CBN News, Washington.
Thank you, Caitlin. Coming up, from the battle scars of physical war to spiritual warfare. Meet a Green Beret on the front lines, fighting to bring faith into war-torn Ukraine. Well, welcome back. Millions of Americans in uniform fought in the global war on terrorism, battling abroad in response to protect the homeland. Today, some of them are standing with the people of Ukraine to defend their homes against Russian aggression. Chuck Holton introduces us to one U.S. Army Green Beret in Ukraine who's there to do battle, but not in the traditional sense.
Sergeant First Class Christian Hickey is a former Marine who went on to join the Army as an elite Special Forces Green Beret. When war broke out in Ukraine, Hickey felt he had to do something, but fighting wasn't part of his calling.
I wasn't called here to fight. I wasn't called here to shed any blood. I was just called here to tell people about blood that was shed for them a long time ago.
That calling led to concern from his superiors over a U.S. National Guardsman working in Ukraine. Nevertheless, God opened the doors for him to go.
I'm not here representing the United States military. I'm not here representing my command. I'm not here representing the National Guard. I'm representing as an ambassador of Jesus Christ, and that's exactly what I'm doing here as a missionary in Ukraine.
After he arrived, he found the Ukrainian troops in desperate need.
These guys don't have medics. They have like one medic per like a line of like over 100 or 150 people on the line.
Tactical combat casualty care happens to be one of Christian's specialties.
I stepped into their training facility, and they saw me, and they knew exactly, like, this guy is different. And they ran up to me and said, "Can you help us? Can you help us?" You know, 7 months ago, they were bakers, they were bus drivers, they were lawyers. Just giving them the skills to be able to stabilize their brothers, to help them get them to a higher level of care. That's mostly what I like to deal with is, hey, here's how you save your brother's life, or here's how to stay alive if you find yourself injured.
And the time he's spent with these men on the front lines has given him a deep appreciation for the hardships they face. It's a different kind of war than he was used to.
They're absolute heroes. I don't think people understand what these Ukrainian soldiers are actually going through. It's the most terrifying and scariest thing I've ever dealt with on the front line. When you cannot see in front of you because they don't have the equipment to be able to do that. And then you have a Russian drone above you who just has freedom of movement to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, and to direct their fires right on top of you.
As the war grinds on, Hickey's mission is evolving to meet the need. Just days after the fall of Kherson, with the population running out of food, Hickey and his team brought a convoy of aid to the rescue.
We're switching gears a little bit. This winter is going to be absolutely tough for the Ukrainian people. There are going to be elderly folks who I love and I respect who are going to die because they're froze to death inside their home. That's what we're going to be here to take them out. I'm going to deliver them firewood. I'm going to deliver them food all throughout the winter. We want to basically be the hands and feet of Jesus. There's a very, very strong, powerful NGOs bought all this food, and they don't have the action arm to actually deliver it. We'll take the food, and we'll make sure it gets to the right people at the right place at the right time.
Reaching the villages around Kherson is especially dangerous since the area is still littered with Russian minefields. So the people are all the more grateful when Hickey and his team risk it all to get to them. But there's one thing these villagers need more than food.
Lord, I pray that you protect these people. The needs that they need every day. From the food, the water, electricity. We want to give the food hand with a Bible and pray. So we just don't want to give food. We actually want to give Jesus. And that food gives us the access and placement to have a conversation about Jesus.
And they're eager to show how the Russians brought death and destruction.
This building behind me is a school
at a little village that we're in right outside of Kherson. The Russians only left here about 7 days ago, and the people in this village say that they didn't leave all at once, and they didn't tell anybody where they were going. Instead, they just sort of slunk away in the middle of the night. And now all that's left are these holes where the Russians parked their tanks right next to this school.
Since I've been here, I've done more long lines of Green Beret stuff than I have ever done in my military career, which is basically, I'm not carrying a gun, I'm not out here to shed any blood, but I'm out here working with the populace, working alongside them, providing them skills they need, providing them food, providing them water, and help build them up.
From Kherson, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Inspiring reporting. Thank you so much, Chuck. Well, Top Gun broke summer box office records, but do you know the story behind the actual fighter pilot school depicted in the film? An insider's look when Faith Nation returns. The Vietnam War exposed a major problem for the U.S. Navy. Enemy pilots were shooting down American planes at an alarming rate. So the Navy turned to a young pilot who started an advanced school for air-to-air combat. As CBN's Heather Sells reports, that school would become known as Top Gun.
You may remember the 1986 movie Top Gun. It brought national attention to the Navy's elite fighter pilot school.
I feel the need for speed.
But it didn't tell the whole story. The story begins in 1956, when Dan Pedersen began flying for the Navy. Based off the West Coast, he and other young pilots flew the skies, ready to intercept Soviet bombers. But then the Vietnam War began, and suddenly the Navy began losing its very best in what it had long prided itself on, air-to-air combat.
You go to dinner at night, and there's empty chairs at the table.
Dan Pedersen founded the Navy's Top Gun school to take on an incredible challenge. The Navy was failing in the skies over Vietnam and losing its pilots at an astonishing rate.
The general thought was that all you had to do was send aviators into action, teach them how to use the equipment, and if they would do that, they would win victories.
Military historian Timothy Orr says the Navy went into the Vietnam War supremely confident after great success in the skies during the Korean War. It quickly began losing pilots, however, and Orr says that's because most had received little training in air combat.
They would get surprised by North Vietnamese MiGs, and if they got into a tangle with them, the MiGs, though they were vastly outdated, were very maneuverable, and the pilots of them knew how to push the limits of their aircraft.
In 1967, Pedersen was flying off the USS Enterprise off the Vietnam coast. In just 4 months, his air group lost 13 men. In what's known as the kill ratio, the Navy was losing 1 plane for every 2 it shot down.
You can't live with losing airplanes like we were, so we had to do something.
Pedersen documents that something, the founding of the Navy's Fighter Weapons School, in his new book. We met aboard the decommissioned USS Midway to talk about one of the great turnarounds in modern military history. For Pedersen, it started with the ALT report, a 1968 brief that examined all the Navy's problems in the air and recommended hardcore training as a remedy.
It was time to get well in the middle of a war, and the only way to get well in a hurry is to do a graduate level school. In other words, train a nucleus of people and have them go out and train the guys in the fleet.
The way the Navy looked at it was, in general, that they were relying too much on the technology, that they needed to kind of get back to teaching pilots how to dogfight, teach them how to use the tricks of the trade to outmaneuver their opponents in the air.
A Navy captain tapped Pedersen, a flight instructor at the Miramar Air Station at the time, to organize and found the school. He offered him no money, no mechanics, and no planes to call their own, along with a tight deadline.
I said, how much time I got? And he said, somewhere over 60 days to 90 days and to have the first class convened. I said, you gotta be kidding me. No, we're gonna do it here. no building, no classroom to teach in. He said, you can do it. He said, improvise.
One of Pedersen's instructors found an abandoned trailer and paid a crane operator a case of scotch to move it. Pedersen then picked 8 of Miramar's finest pilots who would teach a new generation how to dogfight all over again and push their planes to their limits.
You may train, you may think you're the best, but you're going to find out for real. And if you don't do it right, you don't go home.
The extremely practical and finely tuned curriculum taught by specialists who understood mechanics, the tactics of the enemy, and the need for innovation would make all the difference. 3 years later, in the next major aerial campaign against Vietnam, the kill ratio improved 600%. The Navy was now losing 1 plane for every 12 it shot down. Looking back, Pedersen sees the hand of God in it all and says the original bros do as well.
There are no atheists flying combat airplanes. They may think they are for a while, but over the course of time, they'll have things happen to them or their airplane that will bring God right to the surface.
Today, Top Gun continues to take just the top 1% of the Navy's pilots and train them to train others.
The reason that U.S. Navy pilots are among the elite is because of the education they receive.
Pedersen says he considers Top Gun to be bigger and better than ever. But he says he wrote the book for high school kids, trying to figure out what they want to do. He hopes they'll consider the Navy and maybe even flying if they're up for a challenge like no other. Reporting in San Diego, Heather Sells, CBN News.
Great story. Thanks, Heather. The Always Faithful, what some are describing as a God movement among the Marines. You're watching CBN's Faith Nation. Honor, courage, and commitment, core values of the United States Marines. And while those in the ranks of the Corps are considered some of the toughest around, many rely on faith in something much more powerful to complete their military service. CBN's Mark Martin traveled to a South Carolina boot camp with a story of how some describe God on the move among young Marines.
It just feels super honorable to have that title, United States Marine.
CBN News caught up with Jacob Watson as he was about to graduate from boot camp. He's following in the footsteps of both his parents.
It's like something I will never forget or take for granted. Plus, some of the stuff that I've learned was like stuff I never thought I could do. So it was really a blessing to be able to conquer most of these things that I was afraid about at first, but thanks to the Marine Corps, I was able to do.
Watson points to his Christian faith for helping him stay the course.
Without a doubt, the only way I believe at least I got through this was faith in Christ, because a bunch of this stuff, like I said, mentally was, kind of scary and intimidating, but, faith, I'll tell you what, it gets you a long ways.
It's the same story for others here at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in Parris Island, South Carolina.
Throughout boot camp, reading my Bible and praying, it seemed to help me a lot.
And I remember thinking maybe I can't go through this, but I remember just thinking, well, if I have come this far, then God can definitely get me through the rest of it.
Through forming week, I was really just in my head, really, and I needed some help. We went to church, and I was praying to the Lord at night, and I was asking for some words of encouragement. And that next day, 3 songs back to back, just you're an overcomer. He's in a fight. You're in the fight to the final round. So I fought all the way throughout boot camp.
Here's the chapel at Parris Island Marine Corps Recruit Depot. There are 9 chaplains on duty at this installation, and one of their roles is to make sure that every person has the right to practice his or her faith and is free of discrimination.
I'm ensuring that their First Amendment right constitutional right is being protected to exercise their religion.
Lieutenant Dawn Ashley is one of the 9.
I care for them, and that sometimes is through counseling, a lot of times through counseling here at Parris Island, because it's boot camp and they're stressed a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, so we care for them pastorally also.
She said, I wrote this down when you said it, and I meditate on it. I pull it out when I'm having a hard time. I pull it out when things feel like they're really closing in on me, and it gives me a sense of hope. And so as a chaplain, that was one of those moments where I realized that the work that we do really does impact people. It really does kind of buoy their spirit and help them grow in their walk of faith.
Those who we get the honor of serving here, regardless of their faith, we have found that spirituality plays an important part. And for those that are Christians, we've really seen how they have received breakthrough from all of their past challenges, breakthrough while they're here, and we see them really evolve to their higher level of self through Christ Jesus. And we're so honored that we get to love on them, to support them, and to walk alongside with them in this journey.
A lot of times they run away from the faith. They get here and they think they can do it on their own, and they quickly understand that they can't do it on their own. They need God. They need that connection with God. And so a lot of them come back to their faith while they're here.
Jesus means everything to me.
As a drill instructor, Staff Sergeant Evelyn Espinal must be tough as nails to train these recruits. Still, she faces difficult times and shared how the love and strength of God gets her through.
It was a very, very, very emotional time for me. I don't cry often, but when it comes to God and Jesus, I bawl my eyes out. And I needed that. I really needed that. I needed that strength to push through because I was struggling. It was my first years as a drill instructor. Those are the hardest years.
Captain Stephen Sigmund hopes how he lives his Christian faith will be seen and possibly inspire fellow Marines.
Definitely not perfect by any means. No one really is, and Christ did not expect that out of folks either. But to be able to, maybe one person at a time, have someone look at you and say, you know, they are different. There's something that's maybe different about them. And hopefully letting some form of Christ in me manifest itself to be able to have an example that maybe I'm making an impact on one person in each unit that I go to.
Allowing his faith to make an impact, an action Sigmund describes as fulfilling God's calling to be the change or light in the world. Mark Martin, CBN News, Parris Island, South Carolina.
Thanks, Mark. And to the men and women who serve and are veterans and their families, thank you for your service. And thanks so much for watching tonight. We hope you have a great night and see you next time.